Hello everyone, this is Arena International Master Rishikesh Chavan. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to discuss important variations in Grünfeld Defence. Grünfeld Defence was named after Ernst Grünfeld. Ernst Grünfeld won against great Alexander Alekhine with this opening in the year 1922. So let's start. D4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3. Here we are not sure whether black is going to play king's Indian with bishop g7 or he is going to play d5, the Grunfeld defense. d5. Now it is clear that black is going to play Grunfeld defense. Now there are few variations available for white. Maybe he can go for the exchange variation, that is c into d4, or he can play something like knight f3, bishop g7, and then you can go ahead with Russian system is queen b3. Also from this g7 position, white can move ahead with Taimanov variation, which is bishop g5. So let's see both the variations one by one. So let's start with Russian system first. Queen b3, d into c4, queen into c4, castles, e4. Now, in this variation, queen is on c4. Right now, no white piece can attack the queen that, though no black piece can attack the queen that easily. But in the later part of the game, queen may have to move again and again. So here we can check the one Hungarian variation, that is a6. This move is suggested or invented by Hungarian Grandmaster Peter Leko. That's why this variation is named as Hungarian variation. So there are other options also where black can play knight a6, which is Prince variation, and also he can play something like bishop g4, bishop e3, and then nfd7. This is a Smyslov variation. So there are quite a few variations in the Russian system. Let's move with Taimanov variation, that is bishop g5. So here bishop g5, knight e4, bishop h4, preserving the bishop, knight into c3, b into c3, d into c4. And now white can win back his lost pawn by playing queen a4 check, queen d7, and queen into c4. We can say this position is again somewhat equal. It's very early in the game, so right now we cannot predict anything. We can say white's pieces are active, or and black's pieces are very passive right now. But in just a matter of few moves, the black pieces can come out. Black is all set for castling, whereas white will take at least two more moves for castle. There is one more option for white if he doesn't want to play exchange variation. So here after d5, white can play bishop f4. So bishop f4 will lead to famous Grünfeld Gambit. So after bishop g7, e3, castles, pawn into pawn, knight into d5, queen into d5, and now bishop into c7. So here black has sacrificed a c7 pawn. So for this pawn, black can hope for a quick development, because as you can see only one white piece is active, that is the bishop. All other white pieces are still inactive, they are still passive. So white is going to take a lot of time to develop his pieces. So that way this pawn sacrifice looks logical. But we are not going to check this side variation or the other variation. We'll be going ahead with exchange variation, which is the main variation against Grunfeld defense. Knight into d5, e4, knight into c3, and b into c3. After these initial moves, black has allowed white with a big center, e3, c3, d4, e4, and now it's black's job to attack this center. So black can start attacking this center with the moves like bishop g7, c5, queen a5, even knight c6 will come. After the castling, even the rook e8 will join the attack through open d file. So white has to be careful with this strong center of his. Bishop g7, immediately putting pressure on the center. Now this d4 pawn can't move because then bishop into c3 check, and white will lose his rook on a1. Bishop e3, c5, queen d2, queen a5. So queen a5 is again attacking this weak pawn on c3. Again white cannot play d into c5, otherwise he will lose his queen after bishop into c3. One more idea of queen a5 is to vacate the d8 square, so that later on black can play castles and then rook d8, and then rook will join the attack through this open d5. Instead of rook queen a5, there is one more option. Black can go for a quick castling. So the game may progress ahead like this: knight f3, bishop g4, pinning the knight or attacking the knight. Now, black is fighting on the dark squares. So whatever he is playing right now, whether it is queen a5 or maybe knight c6, so all these moves are pressurizing the dark squares, and this f3 knight is defending the dark squares. That way, black wants to remove the defender. So once this f3 knight is gone, these weak squares of c3 and d4 will become more weak, and so black can use that weakness effectively. So of course white is not going to allow black to capture bishop into f3. cd4, cd4, knight c6, h3, kicking the bishop away, bishop d7, and now knight f3 back. So again this position is kind of equal in the sense that black's king is safer compared to white king, but on the other hand white has two strong pawns in the center. So both the players have few advantages and few disadvantages. That way this position is kind of equal. So let's move ahead with the main move, that is queen a5, rook b1. Rook b1 is a tricky move here. Instead of rook b1, white can play rook c1 directly. But the idea of rook b1 is after rook b1, white wants to play rook b5, and then he can capture this pawn for free. So now after rook b1, black has to do something about this rook b5 option. So either he can play b6 and he can left the b5 square unsupported, because now the c5 pawn is protected, or he can play a6 and stop white from playing rook b5. So let's see what happens. We'll start with the a6 variation first. So if black plays a6, then white will shift his rook to c1. Now because of the a6 pawn, there is a hole on b6. So maybe white can use this weakness later on. That is why white played bishop rook b1 first, and then he moved rook to c1. Castles d5, knight d7, knight f3, b5, bishop d3, c4, bishop b1, e5, d into e6, f into e6, and h4. So here white wants to attack through this h file. So maybe white will delay the castling. He will start pushing the pawn ahead, maybe h4, h5, h6, or even he will capture into h into g6, and then he can try using his battery. Also, the knight is available on the king side, and whenever this e4 pawn is pushed ahead, even the b1 bishop will be available to attack black's king. So that way h4 move is logical. What if black plays b6? So bishop b5 check, bishop d7, bishop d3. So this is a tricky move over here, giving that check. White doesn't want to exchange his bishop with black's bishop. There is a reason for that. In this whole structure or whole white's position, the sorry, c4 square is weak, and c4 square is guarded only by this bishop. If white plays bishop into d7, then later on black can use this weakness with his knight. So maybe he can capture the bishop with the knight, and then later on he can think about moving the knight on c4. And once knight comes to c4, then it will be a very strong square for the knight. It's an outpost for knight. So that is why white doesn't want to give up that bishop because that c4 square will prove very important later on. Bishop d3, castles. Here instead of castles, black can even try something like c into d4. So maybe c into d4, knight c6, attacking the weak pawn on d4. We cannot say exactly a weak pawn, but of course that pawn is attacked more times. Knight e2, supporting the pawn. Here again, if white plays something like knight f3, then again bishop g4 will come. So white wants to avoid that. That's why he's playing knight e2 over here. As f1 bishop is already active, so now he can play knight e2. Otherwise, if the bishop is on f1, then white won't be able to play knight e2 because then it will block his bishop. So knight e2, castles, queen into a5, knight into a5, king d2. In this position, it doesn't matter even if black captures the white queen, the white king is any which way going to come to d2. So once queens are off the board, white is not going to castle. He will be keeping his king near the center. So that way, it's not that important who captures the queen first. Knight into a5, king d2, f5, again pressurizing those two strong pawns. f3, maintaining that pressure. e5, d5. So here we can say white has a slight advantage due to this strong passed pawns. But on the other hand, we can say that black has some active pieces. This knight looks trapped on the corner file, that is a file, but it has a lot of important squares available. So later on, black can bring his rook on c file and he can start his attack through c file. Also, this bishop looks block over here, but once rook f c8 is played, black can activate this g7 bishop through bishop f8 and then through this diagonal. So that way, all the black pieces are active. So that is why we can say that this position is somewhat equal. White has a slight advantage just because of that passed pawn. One more option over here we can black can go ahead with is knight c6. So again he is pressurizing the d4 pawn, supporting the pawn. Here also instead of knight f3, white can try something like knight e2 also. Knight f3, castles, rook c1, e6, d5, e into d5, e into d5, knight e5, knight into e5, bishop into e5, and then c4. So this position is again equal, we can say. Slight advantage for white for two reasons. One reason is that white has a pass pawn over here. Other reason is this queen is cut off from the main action, but it's not a big weakness because any which way black can just capture the queen or black can just exchange the queens, and that way his weakness will be gone. So this position is slightly better for white just because of this pass pawn on d5. So let's move back to the main game. Castles, knight e2, e6. Remember this knight e2 in this whole format, whole variation. So we are going to preserve this bishop so that we can defend the c4 square well. Also, we'll try to move this knight to e2. So from e2, it supports both the weak squares, that is c3 and d4. h4, and of course we cannot start attack on the queen side because on the queen side black has the pawn majority. It's 3 against 2. In the center, both the players will keep the center under pressure. Even black is not going to release the pressure in the center, so that leaves the white with just one option, that is to start attack on the king side. h5, stopping the attack. g4 is a very nice move. It's a temporary pawn sacrifice just because because of the e6 pawn, black's light square bishop is blocked. So black's light square bishop cannot participate in the defense to his king. C into d4, c into d4, queen into queen check, king into queen check. even after the queens are exchanged, white has enough compensation for that lost pawn. So for example, h into g4, h5, he will push the pawn ahead. E5, here instead of e5, if black plays c6, then he will be in lot of trouble. So for example, h into g6, f into g6, e5. So after e5, as you can see, this g6 pawn is under attack. Also, lot of open lines are there. Knight can come to f4, and knight can start attacking these two weak pawns. And white can easily double the pawns on the h file. So that way, each and every white piece is participating in the attack on the king side. So this is a good position for white. RBG1. So this is again a very nice move. So here white is going to capture this G4 pawn, and then there will be some added pressure on the G6 pawn. So that is why after H5 he will play something like E5. So again he is asking questions in the center. H into G6, E into d4. Of course, here f into g6 is a blunder, because after bishop c4, black is going to lose lot of material by force. So either he will have to lose a full piece by playing bishop e6, but bishop e6 is not working because it's a free piece, and again the check will be there. So here after bishop c4, black is forced to play something like rook f7, and then white is getting a full exchange over here. So white will be exchange up, and then white can start developing his pieces. Maybe he can push the pawn ahead and create a passed pawn. Then he can develop this knight either through g3 or maybe through c3 and d5, b5, I'm sorry. So that is after h into g6, white black is forced to play e into d4, knight into d4. Of course, white will preserve his bishop pair. Knight c6, knight into c6, b into c6, r at g1. So it looks like an odd move because rook was already on the h file, or open h file. So there was no need to move the rook away. But as you can see, this c6 bishop may create some future discovered attack or pins on this diagonal. So that is why it was better for white to move the rook away from the firing line. So rook at g1 is played, r a d8, pinning the bishop. Rook into g4, f into g6, because now rook is not there on the h file, and also bishop c4 check is not possible because white's bishop is pinned. King e2, unpinning the bishop so that he can play bishop c4 check. Bishop e8. So now after bishop e8, black is prepared to defend this pawn. At the same time, after bishop c4 check, he can even play bishop f7, f4, bishop f7. Instead of bishop f7, black can also try bishop d4. So he is exchanging the dark square bishop, so that this square can be empty, and black king can use this square to move away from this future check and also to support the pawn. One more idea of playing king g7 is, later on if required, black can play rook h8, and then he can use the h file for his rook. But then there follows bishop c4 check, king g7, and rook d1. So again, as you can see, this bishop is pinned over here, and it's very difficult for him to save the material. For example, he is forced to play something like this, and then after rook into rook, bishop into rook, bishop d4 check will be very strong, because bishop d4 check, if he plays bishop f6, then e5 and e6 pawn push is coming up. So again, this is a lost position for black. Also, instead of playing bishop f7, after bishop c4 check, black can go for king g7 as we just discussed. So, sorry, bishop f7, then there follows rook into g6 check. Bishop cannot capture the rook as bishop is pinned. King h7, bishop into f7 is a best move. Rook into f7, and then f5. F5 is winning because, as you can see, this checkmate is almost unstoppable. Maybe black can delay the checkmate max to max with something like bishop into e3. Then there will be rook h1 check, bishop will move back to h6, and then finally rook into h6 checkmate. So this is a totally lost or hopeless position for black. So bishop f7. That is why bishop d4 is not played over here. Black played bishop f7 to stop any future bishop c4 checks. A4, saving the pawn on a2, and also fixing this both the queenside pawns of black. Rook d7. So idea is to protect the king from this seventh rank, and second plan is to double the rooks on the d file. RBG1. So white is also doubling the rooks on the open G file, so that he can capture that G6 pawn for free. Instead of playing rook BG1, white can also try something like E5. So after e5, this bishop is blocked, and also white's bishop is opened from this diagonal. So here uh, black will have to sacrifice an exchange by playing rook into d3, and then game may move ahead like this. Bishop e6. So here this is temporary exchange sacrifice, because wherever this g4 rook moves, black will get his exchange back after bishop f5 in the skewer. And if white plays wrongly, so maybe he will get a full piece over here. So that is why rbg1 is played. Bishop into g4, rook into g4, king f7, bishop d4. And now again this position is very strong for white, because there is this discovered check coming up, and maybe he will lose the bishop in this. Also king can move ahead easily, and he can assist a pawn in becoming a queen. One more thing is that this g6 pawn is definitely going to fall, because there is no enough support for the g6 pawn. So again we can say white is winning in this. Let's move back with the original game. So after rook d7, doubling the rooks on the g file, rook f d8, bishop b1, saving the bishop. So black has doubled his rooks on the d file, but because of this two bishop, there are no safe squares available for black rooks on this d file. They cannot come on even this square also. So even after doubling the rooks, we can say there is no use for black with that doubled rooks. Bishop c4 check. So that's why black is trying to push the king inside, so that he can use his bishops well, and he can maybe finally use the open file for his rooks. Here one more plan for black is to play bishop d4, but bishop d4 won't work, because after e5, bishop into bishop, king into e3. Again there is no check available for the black rooks, and then again this g6 pawn is under attack. White is going to play bishop into g6, bishop into g6, and after rook into g6 check, these two connected passed pawns will decide the issue for white. So it's a lost position for black. So that is why after bishop b1 is playing bishop c4, king f3, sorry, rook d1, rook into g6, rook into g1, rook into g1, bishop b3, e5. Here we can say white is one pawn ahead, but it's not much, because black can capture this pawn and the material will be equal. So both the players will be having two connected passed pawns. The only difference is white's connected passers are much more advanced. So white can just move his king up and start pushing the pawn, and suddenly black will find himself in a spot of bother, because he will lose his bishop as the bishop is pinned. Also maybe sooner or later he will have to sacrifice a piece to stop both the pawns, and that way white will win back extra material. Rook d1. Rook d1 is a good move over here. White Black is thinking about exchanging the rook, so maybe he's expecting white to play rook into rook, bishop into rook check, and then maybe after suppose king d4, let's play a few moves. So rook into rook, bishop into rook check, and if he goes over here, maybe he can think about either getting the king here on the active square, or maybe he can play something like this and start pressurizing these two pawns on this diagonal and this diagonal. But here after rook d1, white has a super move, that is bishop a2. Bishop a2 is a brilliant move. Of course, black cannot accept this free bishop, otherwise he will lose a rook. So that way, black will lose an exchange. Also, here black cannot allow white to capture the rook because it's a free rook. As black cannot play bishop into rook, as this bishop is pinned. So rook d3 is the only move left. Here also, he can try playing something like this, but then again he is going to be pieced down after bishop into b3 check, any black king move, and then he will recapture the rook on b1. That way, as you can see, is a clearly a piece up. One more idea over here is rook d1, sorry, rook d3 is the only move available which will save the rook and at the same time supporting the b3 bishop. But then there follows rook bishop into b3, rook into b3 and e6. And now as you can see, it is almost impossible for black to stop that pawn from queening. For example, he can't even reach this eighth rank with his rook because it will take a lot of time. For example, if you play something like this, then there follows rook into bishop check, king into rook, and after bishop d4 check, the rook is lost. Also, he cannot move from this side because white can simply push the pawn ahead. Now, rook cannot reach to d8, otherwise the rook is gone just like that. And if white, sorry, if black moves the king next to the pawn to capture it, then white has a very nice move of rook into g7, and if king into g7, white will promote the queen safely. So, by looking at this future variations and possibilities, black resigned in this position. So, this is all Grunfeld defense over here. So, between all the among all the variations we discussed, exchange variation is the best possible way for white to use the advantage of strong center, where he is getting three strong pawns in the center, and then he will have to deal with black's attack, which will come for sure with the moves like bishop g7, c5, queen a5, knight c6, etc. But once white defends this attack well, then of course he has a strong center. Also, he can start his attack through this h file by playing h4, h5, etc. So keep these small things in mind. To master any opening, you need to understand all these small things. Only learning the moves is not enough. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you understood whatever lines we discussed over here of Grunfeld Defense. So please do not forget to like the video. Also, please subscribe to our channel so that we can bring you such more videos. So till then, see you soon. Thank you very much, everyone.